Well, we're taking a look back at the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season. We're going to recap, take a look at the storms of note, and those that made some history. So let's start with, our climatology, right? Our tropical season started back in June. June 1st is when it officially kicks off. And you can see here our most busy time of the year is typically somewhere between early August all the way through early October, peaking around September 10th. And we certainly had a very busy September. This was the initial forecast that was put out for the 2024 tropical season. And you can see by the numbers here calling for 23 named storms from Colorado State, 17 to 25 for NOAA. And then, you've got your averages. So this was considered to be, at least forecast-wise, above average by most entities that did a forecast. So how did we pan out? Well, let's look at where the final numbers led us compared to what we had. Again, calling for 11 hurricanes, 8 to 13. Our average is 7. So here is what we ended at, our final numbers. For named storms, 19 to 25 was the forecast. We had 18. Falls right in that window. Hurricanes, calling for 7 to 11. Our final, 11. So on the high end of that prediction. And as for major hurricanes, calling for 3 to 6, we had 5. And of those, 2 had a direct impact on the United States. Look at all of the names, and if you got left out, if you're Tony, Valerie, or William, we didn't quite get there, but we had several named storms, getting through 18 of those. A lot of names, so if we have that many named systems, it's a fairly busy tropical season. So let's do these tropical tracks here. This is a look at all of these storms, where they headed. These are the Atlantic storms. So these are what we like to see when it comes to hurricanes. You had Joyce, Gordon, Leslie, Kirk, Isaac, Patty, Ernesto, all that stayed out in the Atlantic. Fish storms are great. They have no impact to land, and we can watch them from a distance. Let's shift over to the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and we had several what I would call junk systems that didn't really amount to much, but got names. That would be Nadine, Sarah, Chris, and Alberto. All of these kind of floundered around and were big rainmakers for parts of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, other parts of Latin America there. And then we had Rafael, which was a late season tropical system that really fizzled out in the central Gulf. And then you see that track of Milton. We will get to that here in just a moment. Looking at the ones that moved far inland, these ones had a bigger impact, some of them profound. Francine made it all the way up into central Arkansas. Helene doing a U-turn over Kentucky back into Tennessee. And then Beryl and Debbie made it all the way up to Canada. As we look at those tracks, that is pretty far inland. So let's start by taking a more in-depth look at Hurricane Beryl. Lifespan, June 26th to July 11th. This one set several records. Let's start with back when it initially formed. Very, very far to the east in the Atlantic. Weak disorganized tropical low on June 26th. This initially was slow developing, and then it blew up as it got closer to the Caribbean. It became a major hurricane on June 30th, and by July 2nd, it reached Category 5 status. Now, this was the earliest on record for the Atlantic Basin. It had winds of 161 miles an hour and a measured sea level pressure at 938 millibars. And then just after that, it reached its peak strength of its entire lifespan. This had 167 mile an hour winds with wind gusts up to 201 miles an hour and a measured sea level pressure of 935 millibars. So its next stop took it very close to Jamaica, where we had a strong storm surge on the southern side of the island, but it just missed making a landfall. This could have been a totally different story had this made a landfall over Jamaica. This was back on July 2nd. Then we move ahead to July 5th and 6th. This did make landfall. And just to the south of Cancun, it was a Category 1 storm. So it weakened a good bit as it approached the Yucatan Peninsula, which is certainly good news. While over the Yucatan, it weakened to a tropical storm before re-emerging into the Gulf. And then it makes its landfall near Texas, Matagorda, as a Category 1 storm on July 8th. Its winds were 80 miles an hour, with wind gusts registered as high as 98. And then it moved inland. So again, this ended up being obviously, it was impactful, but rather than a Category 5, as it was in the Caribbean, making landfall as a Category 1. And then as it moved north, it was really a rainmaker. Some highlights of this: 3 to 6 inches of rain over the Arc-La-Tex region. It spawned one EF2 tornado in Jasper, Texas. Eventually, by July 11th, it dissipated over the Great Lakes. So the next storm of note here, Hurricane Debbie, July 31st to August 10th. Let's talk about this one because this was also a very slow developing system. Initially on July 31st, it was just a weak tropical low, big old broad area of rain, central pressure, 1014. That's very close to the average sea level pressure, so nothing too strong. It moved all the way through the Caribbean islands, touching every single one of them as really a tropical low. It actually didn't make tropical storm status until August 4th, so it went several days before it reached this level. And wind speeds about 58 miles an hour at this point as it passes just to the west of the Florida Peninsula. Again, it was slow developing, several factors to that, not ideal conditions, some wind shear involved that didn't allow it to intensify. It did, however, reach Category 1 strength as it made landfall near Steinhatchee, Florida. This was at 7 o'clock Eastern time as a Category 1 storm. Wind speeds 80 miles an hour, and then it quickly moved across North Florida. And this is where it gets interesting because you could argue that some of the impacts were most significant once it reached the Carolinas. So you look at this timeline here, August 6th, 7th, and 8th. It kind of floundered just offshore. That's a lot of rain for the coastal Carolinas, then moved north toward the Appalachian Mountains before it dissipated over the span of the next 2 to 3 days. But we had some wind and rain all the way up into the Ohio Valley as well as New England. Numerous flood watches, warnings. I believe there was some flooding near Washington, D.C., and it was also very windy, especially along the coastline of New England. So going back to when Debbie made landfall here, one of the focal points of this was rain. So a couple key points here as it did indeed make landfall. You had storm surge of 3 to 5 feet along the Big Bend all the way down to Cedar Key. Wind gusts 30 to 50 miles an hour, and the max was 70, and that was, of course, near its landfall, coastal regions of the Big Bend. But then the rainfall totals were very prolific for this. Lake City was the highest total, 19.67 inches of rain. And this spanned actually several power outages across Florida and Georgia. And then, of course, as it flounders around the coastline of South Carolina, you see that bullseye there, 12 plus inches for coastal regions south of Myrtle Beach. It's a lot of rain over a short period of time. Again, tropical systems, they carry a lot of water, so you don't necessarily have to be strong. This was tropical storm status when it dropped 12 inches of rain in that part of the country. So now we move further north, and again, this was fairly sluggish, moving up through central North Carolina, and then eventually towards New England. We had high rainfall accumulations here. Carolinas, Green Pond, South Carolina, 16.55 inches, and then we saw a range of 2 to 6 inches as far north, places like Pennsylvania, parts of New York. This one had a death toll. There was 8 fatalities associated with this storm before it finally dissipated over Canada. So as a tropical depression, as a tropical low, this still did have a very big impact on parts of the United States. So next up we have Hurricane Francine. This one was a Gulf storm, September 6th to September 14th. And this one intensified right before it made landfall to a Category 2 storm. So this made it the 3rd U.S. landfall of the season, making landfall at around 5 o'clock, just to the southwest of Morgan City. 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds and a central pressure of 972 millibars. The biggest thing with this one was storm surge, of course, along the Louisiana coastline, very low sea heights or sea level. And so that allowed storm surge, and then of course on top of that you had the rain as well. So next up is Hurricane Francine. This one was a Gulf system, and it was a tropical storm for a good part of its life coming out of the southern Gulf, strengthening to a Category 2 right before it made landfall. 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds as it moved onshore, about 30 miles southwest of Morgan City. And this part of Louisiana sits very low, so the biggest impacts here was storm surge and flooding. Of course, tropical systems carrying that rain. We had 3 to 8 inches. It dissipated very quickly over Mississippi, and typically tropical systems will bring about severe weather for areas to the east of center, but we did not have any severe weather here in Alabama, which was good. Just some rain showers in the days following there, September 12th and 13th. This next one, Helen, may have been the most impactful historic storm of the 2024 season. This spanned from September 21st to the 28th. So you look at that, it's like, all right, 7 days. How much damage can it do in 7 days? Well, a lot. Let's start with its initial inception. Here's a tropical low way down in the southwestern Caribbean, forming there on the 21st. It moved to the north, passing just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, Cozumel and Cancun when it first reached its Category 1 strength, wind speed of 75 miles an hour. It then took a very quick track to the north and east into the Gulf. Waters at the time very warm, and that helped it intensify quickly to a major hurricane, 120 mile an hour winds, maximum wind gust at this point on the 26th, 150 miles an hour. And then, of course, because of the warm sea surface temperatures, it intensified further to a Category 4 storm as it makes landfall. This was a night landfall, 11:10 Eastern Time, the Big Bend as a Category 4. This was just to the southwest of Perry, Florida, and this was actually amongst the most powerful storms in history to strike the United States. Upon its landfall, it had winds sustained of 140 miles an hour. But this was just the beginning of what Helen would do. You see its track, the 27th and 28th, came right up through Georgia and right over the Appalachians. And this caused some catastrophic flooding, for some 1,000-year flood. And we will not soon forget this one. 30 inches of rain recorded in Busick, North Carolina over a 3-day stretch. And this had an estimated 2,000 landslides, but who knows, there were so many. It was a very, very impactful storm. One of the things that made Helen so significant was actually the setup leading up to it. It also was the reasoning, looking back, its track shifted from where we initially thought. So here's the setup leading up to it. This is the setup from the atmospheric setup, rather, on September 26th. So a couple features here. You have a cutoff upper low that's situated right over Arkansas, Missouri. We had this stalled frontal boundary in place, and this ended up being key in directing this further to the east. A lot of tracks had this coming up right along the Alabama-Georgia line, which it did not. It shifted much further to the east. And this might be the most impactful part of this system. So here's Helen, right here in the northeastern Gulf. We had a relative high. So this is this weak surface high. That's the Bermuda high. And what this did is it formed a channel. This convergence between Helen's winds and that pressure gradient of that high caused basically a channel of water vapor to just flow north towards the Appalachians. So here's the other thing to note. There was a precursor rain event that took place before Helen even made landfall. You had several locations here that had showers leading up to this. So the ground was already saturated, which is a big problem, and that is one of the reasons that we had such historic flooding with this. So let's show you now the track. Of course, Helen makes landfall, moves up through central Georgia, again further east than a lot of us anticipated, myself included. It meandered around the middle of the country, but the rainfall totals with this were significant. Again, keep in mind, before this made landfall, we had a couple days of rain over parts of Tennessee, the Appalachian Mountains, including Asheville, one of the spots hardest hit. You had areas in North Carolina, South Carolina, that registered 15, 20 inches of rain. I believe the high point was closer to 30 inches of rain. As we mentioned, it was a 1,000-year flood. That means there was a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting this much rainfall, and we likely won't see something like that again. So Helen what it was, the setup that led up to it, making it a very historic storm and a very devastating storm, as we, of course, saw in the aftermath. All right, and the final one we're going to follow here, Hurricane Milton, October 4th to October 10th. This one also a very intense hurricane. Let's start as it forms in just to the north of the Bay of Campeche, called the Southwest Gulf. Weak disorganized low on October 4th. This one taking a big right turn as it becomes a Category 1 storm on October 6th. This quickly intensified, I mean very, very quickly. It reached its peak intensity with 173 mile-an-hour winds and a peak wind gust of 213 miles an hour as it moved just to the north of the coastline there on October the 8th. This would continue to move off to the east. And of course, folks in Florida having Ian just a couple years ago, not looking forward to this one. Milton makes landfall near Siesta Key as a major Category 3 storm, 120 mile-an-hour winds, and a central pressure of 954 millibars. This was on October 10th. The one good thing about this raced across central Florida. By later on that day, it was a Category 1 storm, and it left. But here's the deal with Milton. There's 46 confirmed tornadoes in Florida, and there were 2 EF3s. That's a high-end tornado for a tropical system. We don't typically see those. EF0s, EF1s. This was an EF3, and there was 2 of them. You had a storm surge, 5 to 6 feet along the coast. How about St. Petersburg, Florida, registering 18.8 inches of rain, widespread flooding, as well as power outages. So again, Milton, another one of those very impactful storms. Final takeaways from the 2024 season. It was active. It was above average. I think it did pretty well for what the forecast called for. 5 U.S. landfalling hurricanes, 2 of them major. And you had the 18 named storms. Milton and Helene, major impacts. We talked about Helene. Beryl setting records, earliest Category 5 in the history. And certainly glad to close the door on this tropical season.